Okay, I think we're getting to critical mass. Again, hello everyone, welcome and thank you so much for joining the launch of the Science-Based Targets Initiative Sector Guidance for Forest, Land, and Agriculture, or FLAG as we say. Why don't we go ahead and jump in? As a reminder, this is a webinar format, so your camera and microphone are automatically muted. Please send any questions you have via the Q&A button. We will try to review as many questions as we can live at the end of our session. We'll also be answering some of the more specific questions by chat. And if we can't get to your question, we encourage you all to please review the materials that we'll run through at the end. And if you still have a question or can't find your answer, please reach out to us. Also wanted to note we're offering limited interpretation services today. You can access those through the interpretation button in your webinar controls. Next slide, please. So we will start today with a brief introduction of the Science-Based Targets Initiative. We'll follow that with an introduction to the FLAG team. We're going to run through the FLAG guidance overall, touch on some key need-to-knows, and review an example, followed by a Q&A session. So again, please submit those questions by the Q&A button, and we'll get started. To kick us off, I would like to introduce Luis Amaral, the CEO of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, to start the launch. Luis, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you so much for the introduction and welcome everyone. I'm really excited to be here with you today, unveiling a milestone for the decarbonization of the forest, land, and agricultural sector. The world's first standard method to cover land-related emissions and removals. That is very special to me on a personal level too, since I spent most of my career working in these sectors, promoting investments in better farming practices, working to end deforestation and promote restoration. But before getting into the details of the SBTi FLAG guidance, let me take you on a journey through the SBTi. In the next few minutes, I will share with you where we are right now and where we are heading. The Science-Based Targets Initiative was founded in 2015 by 4 partner organizations. The SBTi enables business and financial institutions to set ambitious climate targets aligned with science. With over 3,600 companies having committed to setting a science-based target and 1,700 of those validated, the SBTi is increasing ambition across corporate climate action. And there's evidence that companies with validated targets are delivering absolute emissions reductions at scale, leading the way on decarbonizing twice the rate of the global average. That's for the validated ones. It is imperative to take action and it's imperative to take radical and immediate action to cut emissions, change the trajectory of global temperature increases, and exponentially grow the number of companies setting emission reduction targets, if the private sector wants to remain economically competitive and minimize human suffering from the impacts of global warming. The SBTi has several projects underway, having just launched just last week our cement guidance. The FLAG guidance launched today, and the shipping sector pathway is coming soon. Here's a quick snapshot of other standards and guidances currently in development. We want to achieve this technical completeness of going on more details on the idiosyncrasies of the missing sectors. These sector development projects have been and are being tailored to support companies in specific industries to align their decarbonization efforts with science and continue to accelerate the exponential growth of science-based targets. Please check the SBTi webpage for details and updates on how to get involved. Before I hand it over to the FLAG team for the presentation of SBTi FLAG guidance, I first want to congratulate the team for the incredible work over the past 2 years on this project. With the land sector being underserved in the scientific literature, significant parts of this work had to be done from scratch. Thank you especially to the WWF team, Martha and Krista, for their leadership and expertise on this work. I also want to thank the SBTi fully dedicated staff, which has been involved into this as well, such as Teresa, Fernando, but please all the rest of the team take my compliments. Also, I really want to emphasize our thanks to the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation for providing the majority of the funding for this project. I know we have Sabine Milter on the call with us, and we're very grateful for her vision and seeing how critical this work would be. Lastly, to all of you across businesses, civil society, and academia who've provided valuable inputs and review throughout the project. To keep 1.5 degrees global temperature targets within reach, tackle food crisis risks, and enable the transformation to a global net zero future, land-related emissions are paramount. Land-intensive sectors need to incorporate goals to tackle those challenges within the center of their business models. And I'm certain that the SBTi flag guidance will be key to support this decarbonization effort. Now, I'll hand over to Martha to kick us off.
Great, thanks, Luis. Paulina, can I ask you to go back one slide to the faces? So thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. I'm Martha Stevenson. I'm a senior director at WWF in the Forest Program, and also have been leading the flag work closely with the team that you see here. And first, I wanted to thank the team for writing the guidance. The folks who wrote the guidance, you see them here. Lead author was Krista Anderson, with contributions from Teresa, Tim, and myself. And also wanted to acknowledge Paulina Moreno, who's been providing communication support, and of course, the whole SBTi team. It has been an absolute pleasure working with this team through a global pandemic. And I think it's fascinating that most of us here did not meet in person until about a month ago. And that is just a testament to the work you can do when you have a shared goal, despite the countervailing winds. Although I would say I do not recommend reviewing various climate models via Zoom calls. It's not an efficient process, but it's certainly one that we undertook with gusto. So one more acknowledgement kind of at the top, you know, we stand on the shoulders of giants. Without some of the scientific advancements in this sector over the past 3 years, we would not have been able to do this work. And I just want to acknowledge a handful of scientists who really provided the literature and backbone for our work: Stephanie Rowe, Pete Smith, Nancy Harris, Bronson Griscombe, Peter Ellis, and many others. But without those efforts, we would have not been able to deliver this model. And so we're grateful. Next slide. As Louise mentioned, the flag guidance was funded by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. Qantas provided consulting services, particularly on the commodity pathways and enhancing those with land use change and removals. We had additional project funding and pilot testing from the companies that you see here on the screen. Okay, next slide. Actually 2 forward, and we'll jump into the good part. So why undertake the flag guidance? The big headline here is basically the flag sector, or AFOLU, agriculture, forestry, and other land use emissions, contribute 22% to global emissions annually. That is a significant chunk of emissions, and it had not been covered by corporate inventories until this work moved forward. So while we've been working on energy and various industry emissions for a long time, we have not been able to cover this sector because of the lack of accounting guidance, the lack of inventory data. And so a lot of what we're doing here is trying to fill as much of that 22% gap as possible for the corporate sector to make sure that these emissions are finally on the books. The next slide, please. The main 3 areas of activity that we are addressing within this flag guidance are land use change, land management, and carbon removals. So on land use change, we're talking about all land use change is included in the model. So from deforestation to forest degradation to conversion of shrublands or grasslands for agricultural reasons, peat burning, etc. So all of that is included in land use change. And that is half of the AFOLU emissions. So that means that's 11% of global emissions come from land use change every year. And it is critical that we address these emissions. And that was, again, one of the main drivers of us wanting to undertake this guidance development. The second set of emissions are around land management. So those activities that occur on farm and in forest as we are producing these various soft commodities. Those include things like enteric emissions and manure management, fertilizer production, and machinery use on farm and in forest, as well as flux accounting of what's happening within forest year on year. Another critical part of emissions. As I said, this sector has a secret weapon. It manages plants and it can store carbon within those plants, that biomass, and also within the soils. And so this is really different from most of the other industry sectors that we look at within the SBTi, because we have this removals element that is a core part of its contribution to 1.5 degree pathways. So we also have included carbon removals within this model, but these are really only those removals that are engaged within the forestry and agriculture supply chains. So the types of activities we're looking at here are forest restoration and silvopasture, improved forest management, agroforestry systems, and also enhancing soil organic carbon and biochar. So when we combined the emission reductions and the removals opportunities, this sector as a whole has the potential to deliver up to 30% of needed climate mitigation by 2050. So this is a critical sector for getting to net zero. Next slide, please. So how does this work? For those of you who are not familiar with corporate accounting and management, I've just provided a quick schematic here to walk through it. First, companies will measure and account their greenhouse gas inventory. The most common standard to use is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, but of course there are other standards. Then after a company knows where it's starting from, what its baseline is, it would use tools from the Science Based Targets Initiative to set an ambitious target that would be in line with 1.5 degree futures. After setting their target, companies should disclose both their inventory and their target on platforms like CDP or in their corporate social responsibility report, but making sure that information is transparent so we as a community can work on this together and hold each other accountable. Step 4 is the most important. This is why we're doing all of this to begin with, right? This is the step where we actually make physical change in the world. We reduce emissions. And in the case of FLAG here, we're increasing removals. We're doing both of those things. So this is the critical action step. And then with any good management plan, rinse then repeat, right? So we do this and update it annually. So as has been mentioned several times now, we had some gaps here for the land sector in particular. Next slide. We lacked both the comprehensive accounting guidance across the land sector for emissions and removals, and also the target setting guidance. So the World Resources Institute and WWF worked together to draft a proposal to raise money for these two projects to be done as sister projects in parallel. So our teams have been working very closely together throughout this. And as I mentioned, these two projects have been funded by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. The WRI team has just launched the draft of the land sector emissions and removals guidance. And they will be, after this webinar, launching the public consultation period for that draft guidance. So that's happening in the next hour. And then, of course, what we're talking about today, the WWF and SBTi teams co-led the development of the forest, land, and agriculture guidance, which we'll dig in more on today. But I just want to make sure folks recognize the overlap or the connection between these projects, because early on, I think there was some confusion. So again, we have accounting guidance. How do we set our baseline in greenhouse gas protocol? We have our target setting guidance coming out from SBTi. Next slide. And a quick overview of the FLAG development process. As I mentioned, we had a corporate consultative group. They provided, lots of insights into data gathering, how the tool was working, helped us find glitches in the tool, et cetera. I also wanted to call out the World Resources Institute and other WWF colleagues for helping to QA/QC the tool too and pick up different problems that we have with it. So super grateful for that support. We had consultation throughout the project with land experts within SBTi's various advisory groups, and multiple dedicated NGO workshops and webinars throughout the development process. I want to call out specifically here, we worked closely with the Accountability Framework Initiative on the land use change aspects, both deforestation and conversion. And so we worked closely with the Secretariat, and tomorrow, I think at 9 o'clock Eastern, we will be launching a document that's co-written by the Accountability Framework, the SBTi flag team, and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol team that really walks companies through, or NGOs or others who are curious about this space, the differences between deforestation commitments and climate emissions targets, because they are different, there is some overlap. So we wanted to make sure, we felt there was a need for a special dedicated document to walk between these two spaces. So please look for that publication as well. It will be really helpful. We did a public consultation over January and February, reaching over 160 organizations. And then of course, lots of bilateral engagement. And again, thank you to everyone who reached out with questions during the process, suggestions. Always grateful to receive feedback. Next slide. I'm going to hand it over here to Krista Anderson, again, lead author of the guidance and who has been leading a lot of the technical work to dive into some of the details. Thank you.
Thanks, Martha. You can go to the next slide. I want to talk now about some of the key must-knows for target setting. So when you get really down to the nuts and bolts, the first thing to share is that this is what the flag guidance offers. First, of course, we have this flag tool. If you've been familiar with science-based targets for some time, the image of this tool should look really familiar. It's built based on the other SBTi tools and meant to be used similarly. It obviously covers flag emissions in this case, and it can be downloaded from our website now so that you can see all of the data underlying how to set a flag target and all of the different pathways included. Then we also have, of course, a flag guidance document. So this is the written document that contains all of the details about which companies need to set targets, when, which data are used, all of the kinds of side cases and questions, many of which I'm seeing here in the chat. And then finally, we have a detailed methods document. This document goes in detail through all of the methods that we used for setting these targets and pathways, for developing them, what underlying data are used, and what formula were used in this development. So these are the three main things that you will find on our website now as you're looking into the details on flag target setting. Next slide. From here, I want to go into 4 key areas, places where we hear a lot of questions that we think are really important things to know about this new flag guidance. So the first is who sets a flag target and when. I'll talk through that a little bit more. Then what is the flag target structure? What are the options when you're setting a flag target? Third, I want to talk about land conversion, land use change, really popular and important topic in flag. And finally, I want to touch on carbon removal, something that's new for science-based targets. So I'm going to go through each of these 4 in a step more of detail on the following slides. You can go to the next slide now, and I'll start with who sets a target and when. In terms of who, there are 2 principal criteria. So for A, the following SBTi sectors must set a flag target. If you're in forest and paper products, food production for agricultural production or animal source, food and beverage processing, food and staples retailing, and tobacco. And these are SBTi designated sectors. You can find that information about SBTi sector classification on our website, and there's a link here on this slide as well. That's the first criteria. The other criteria is that companies in other SBTi sectors must also set a flag target if they have flag-related emissions totaling 20% or more of the company's overall emissions across scopes 1, 2, and 3. So if you're in a required sector, or if you have 20% or more of your emissions coming from flag, those are the folks who need to set a flag target. Secondarily, when are flag targets required? I'm seeing some questions on this also in the chat. There are 3 main groups here. The first 2 apply to companies who already have set some kind of a science-based target. So for the first group, companies who already set their science-based target before January of 2020, if they are required to have a flag target, they need to set it by December of 2023, the end of 2023. For companies who already set a science-based target and they did that after January of 2020, but before next April, they're going to need to add a flag target by the end of 2024. So for companies who've already got their SBT, you're going to need to add flag by the end of 2023 or the end of 2024 if it's a requirement for you. C, that final category in the final bucket is companies who are setting their science-based target for the first time. And for these companies, it'll be required after April of 2023 to add a flag target if you are in need of a flag target. So after next April, all companies are going to need to add flag targets at the same time that they set their general science-based targets for energy and industry. I can go to the next slide. That covers who and when. And now I want to dive in a little bit to the flag target structure and options. Of course, first of all, zooming out to SBTi in general, you see in this blue box the traditional SBTs. They cover energy and industry. They use the many existing science-based targets methods, and they cover all the non-land emissions. What we're doing with flag is we're adding on a separate target. So all companies would still have their energy and industry target, and now they'll be adding on, if required, a flag target. This flag target in the orange box uses the new flag guidance, of course, and it covers all land-related emissions. So within that flag target, there are two main approaches for target setting. You see those on the far right, and I'll talk about each of them. The first pathway is the flag sector pathway. This is especially relevant for demand-side actors, but also for supply-side actors who don't have an alternative method. And it covers the entire flag sector. So all forestry, agriculture, obviously livestock, and also demand-side measures, diet shift, food loss and waste. These are included in the food sector pathway. The flag sector pathway is an absolute contraction pathway. So it is based on absolute contraction approach, and it can be used for companies who have emissions anywhere in this sector, as well as removals. The underlying data for the flag sector pathway comes from Rowe et al. 2019, a scientific paper that takes a review of all of the top-down integrated assessment models that are relevant for a 1.5-degree future in the land sector, along with the bottom-up scientific peer-reviewed literature on what mitigation is possible and needed in the land sector. And that's how we set these targets. So that's that first flag sector pathway. The second approach, the second option for flag target setting is the commodity intensity pathways. And these are specifically for supply side actors. Under the commodity intensity pathways, there are 11 commodities with specific mitigation pathways: beef, dairy, pork, poultry, timber, rice, soy, palm oil, maize, wheat, and leather. So for each of these commodities, there's a specific mitigation pathway, an intensity-based mitigation pathway that lets companies know at what rate do we expect the intensity of emissions to decrease for that sector. We also, for the first time in science-based targets, have made these pathways regional. So that means that for companies who are setting commodity pathway targets for one of these commodities, they also specify from which region they're sourcing that commodity. And this enables targets to be specified to what are the average intensity of emissions in a given region, and also what are the mitigation options for that region. This is really important in the land sector because of the variety of approaches and also because of the diversity of agricultural opportunities. So these commodity intensity pathways were built on one of the main integrated assessment models that's really well parameterized for the land sector. It's called Image 3.0, and you can find out much more about it in our methods document. So these are the two main approaches under flag target setting. That sector pathway covers everything in overall sector pathway, and then these specific commodity intensity pathways, which are intensity based for those specific commodities. Next slide, please. That's a general overview. And now I still have these two issues I want to talk about. First, land conversion. This is something that's really important in terms of land emissions because it really is such a large share. And there are two main ideas here. The first is greenhouse gas emissions from land conversion. I want to re-emphasize that all land use change and all conversion emissions are included in the flag target setting pathways. So all land use change we've included in the modeling in terms of company reporting and setting targets based on those emissions. And Companies need to include land use change and conversion emissions in their inventory with a 20-year look back from their baseline year. And this is in alignment with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, Land Sector and Removals Draft. It's also part of the standard practice for land use change accounting for some time and in allocating those emissions over a 20-year period. So that's the element of including land conversion and the greenhouse gas emissions in that target setting. All land use change is covered there. In addition to that, FLAG requires a deforestation commitment. So when companies set their FLAG target, they also need to submit a no deforestation commitment that takes this form. Company X commits to no deforestation across its primary deforestation linked commodities with a target date of year, no later than 2025. When companies set these deforestation commitments, they're recommended to align them with the Accountability Framework Initiative, and that includes a 2020 cutoff year and also targets for no conversion and no peak conversion. Next slide, please. This is the fourth and final deep dive issue that I want to talk about today, and it's carbon removals. From the top, to clarify, offsets are not included in FLAG. But carbon removals are almost half of what the FLAG sector contributes to a 1.5 degree future, half of the mitigation potential. So for this reason, when we developed FLAG, we included removal activities, and they're in fact required in terms of what mitigation FLAG expects. These removals are from in supply chain actions. You can think of things like improved forest management, improved soils management, increased silvopasture, so trees on grazing land, and biochar application. These are the kinds of activities that can lead to increased carbon sequestration within a company's supply chain. Removals that are from outside of supply chain activities, also often called offsets, are not included in FLAG. And therefore, in supply chain removals can be accounted, of course, towards a FLAG target. However, these in supply chain removals cannot be counted towards an energy or industry SBTi target. And that's one of the main reasons why we have separate targets. You have your traditional energy industry target, and you have the separate FLAG target where removals can be included. Next slide. So that was a summary of the top 4 must-knows on target setting for FLAG. From here, I want to turn to my colleague, Teresa, to talk about a target setting example.
Thanks, Krista, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I will spend a few minutes to present you a hypothetical case to illustrate FLAG target setting. Next slide, please. This is about Company C, which is a large US retail company specialized in grocery items and general merchandise. The company will commit to reduce emissions by setting a science-based target for the first time. And because the company operates in a FLAG designated sector, which is food and staples retailing, it must also set a FLAG target. So this is additional to the traditional non-FLAG target. As we see in this table, most of the company C emissions are in scope 3. So these emissions are not associated with activities directly controlled by the company, but are linked to activities in the company's value chain. The company has 20 million tons of FLAG emissions in scope 3, and then separately we see another 30 million tons of non-FLAG emissions, also in scope 3. The company has still a small share of non-FLAG emissions in scope 1 and a small share of emissions in scope 2 as well. And we see that the FLAG-related emissions are in scope 3 category 1, associated with purchased goods and services. So the company will need to set a separate target for those 20 million tons of land-related emissions. And the other 30 million tons of scope 3 emissions must be covered in the traditional SBTi non-FLAG target. Next, please. Let's highlight some key points of this case. So first, Company C has not yet set that science-based target. They must do so when setting a FLAG target. The FLAG target must align with all SBTi criteria, including separation of flag and energy industry emissions, non-flag, alignment with 1.5 degrees Celsius, having a base year of no earlier than 2015, and coverage of at least 67% of Scope 3 emissions. In this case, we are assuming that Company C covers 100% of the Scope 3 emissions. For consistency, Company C is encouraged to use the same base year and target year for their flag and their overall target. The target year must be within 5 to 10 years after submission, and Company C choose a base year of 2019 and a target year of 2027. To communicate its flag target, Company C must follow this form. Company C commits to reduce Scope 3 flag GHG emissions X% by 2027 from a 2019 base year. Next, please. So Company C will be using the sector pathway to calculate a flag target for all its land-based emissions. And this is how the flag sector tool looks like. Companies need to enter the base year, the target year, and the flag base year emissions. Then the tool shows the results graphically and in form of tables. You can see that Company C starts with those 20 million tons of flag emissions in 2019, as informed by the company, and should have no more than 15,100,000 tons of emissions in 2027. So having a total abatement of 4,800,000 tons of CO2 emissions, which means a flag target of 24.2% emissions reduction by 2027. The tool also shows an estimate of removals and emissions reduction share in this abatement, as you can see in the right side of the slide. Next slide. So as we see, the sector pathway form a flag target for Company C of 24% emissions reduction, including removals by 2027. So with that, I thank you all again for your time, and I will hand over back to Krista. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Teresa. You can go to the next slide here. And I just want to turn to my colleague, Tim Letts. I know that we're going to be starting the Q&A session live now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Krista. And we've got a number of companies asking great questions here. We'll try to get through as many as I can. I'm going to start to consolidate a couple because I don't think we'll have time to get through them all. Martha, maybe we could start with you. There's a number of questions in the chat asking about the 20-year look back, why that was selected, and what are the implications if companies don't have access to good historic data on land use change. Could you maybe cover the high points of that requirement?
Sure, yeah. So as Krista identified, so within the model for coming up with the flag targets, all land use change is included, not just deforestation, but all land use change. So I just want to make sure that's clear. That's a question we get a lot. But standard both within the IPCC and corporate accounting, whenever we're calculating land use change, we always have this 20-year look back or legacy emission factor where we need to look back on the land over 20 years and include any land use change event in the inventory that occurred over that time, or a linear allocated portion of that. The details of this and how it will be applied are aligned with the greenhouse gas protocol. And so to set a science-based target for submission of flag, the greenhouse gas protocol accounting guidance, which I highlighted earlier, is what we're using or pointing companies to in terms of what the methodology is there. And so that 20-year look back is standard. And then for data sources, I guess I would say two things. From a remote sensing perspective, we've got good data kind of looking back those 20 years. We also, within the greenhouse gas protocol guidance, you'll see that there are methodologies for whether you have direct traceability or if you're working more at a statistical level, and you can use those to estimate what your land use change emissions would be if you're, say, working with something like a scope 3 where it's out of your direct ownership or operations. So there are multiple methods that you can use to do these estimates, very clearly outlined within the greenhouse gas protocol. And then one more set of tools that they have recently published. So the draft guidance is out for public comment through the end of November. And part of what the team has provided is a review of many of the tools and also data sets that are available to support calculating these various baselines. So I would go to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol website, and you can find this Excel file that reviews all the tools. And then they also link on a number of criteria of how these tools or data sets align with various elements that are in the accounting standard. So all of that is available to help companies comply with this 20-year look back period.
Great, thanks, Martha. Krista, maybe we'll turn to you again for a consolidated question. There's a number of questions in the chat about the different treatment of removals versus offsetting, insetting. Can you again just review the high points of the utilization of removals and maybe clarification of between insetting, offsetting, and the approach that FLAG takes?
Yeah, thanks. And I've seen some good follow-up questions in the chat on this, as I mentioned. So for the first time, FLAG is including in target setting removals that are within the supply chain. So within your scope 1, 2, 3 boundary, these are important removals that are part of how we meet our land sector mitigation. So if they're within the supply chain boundary of a company, they can be included. Of course, you need to follow the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, land sector and removals guidance that Martha mentioned. What is not included and cannot be used to meet a FLAG target is offsets. So offsets outside of the supply chain of a company. These are separate and cannot be used to meet a FLAG target. Of course, when removals are used to meet a FLAG target, that's always separate because they are separate targets from the energy and industry or traditional FLAG target. I'm seeing a number of questions about insetting. We generally don't use the term insetting as it can be confusing. There are many, many different definitions of it. But what I would say is that to the extent that you think of insetting as using removals from within the supply chain towards a FLAG target, that's something that's totally acceptable. However, if you're thinking of this as using a market-based approach to think about where are there removals in the broader supply shed, that's a place where it's not clear that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, land sector, and removals guidance allows for accounting. And so at this time, I would say that's not included. That's something to follow in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Let me just turn to my colleagues here on the screen if anyone wants to add anything on this topic before we go to the next question.
Maybe just to reiterate again, as you said, this sector needs to deliver both emissions reductions and removals. It's not an either or. It gets complicated because so much of whether or not in flux accounting on land, if we are either emitting more than we are sequestering on site, that could change year on year, practice by practice. So we do have this flux accounting element that makes it complicated. But I just want to reiterate, we need both, and this is not an either or. If we don't deliver these removals, then we are not going to be in line for that 1.5 degree future.
Great, thank you all. Teresa, there's a question from a company that says they are purchasing multiple commodities listed in the commodity pathways. They also use wood pellets for bioenergy. Can you maybe cover the relation of bioenergy to the FLAG project and SBTi's general bioenergy guidance?
Yes, Tim, thanks. Actually, bioenergy emissions are not included under FLAG, but SBTi overall criteria covers bioenergy. So bioenergy is included in the traditional non-FLAG SBTi target. So this is the first thing to highlight. And the issue that is why bioenergy emissions and removals are currently separate from FLAG is first because the bioenergy criterion predate the flag project. So companies were already including those emissions in the conventional target. And second is because most of the companies that have those emissions related to bioenergy are not companies in the land sector. They are mostly companies in the transport sector. So we need to do further analysis to see what would be the best approach to cover these emissions, and if we should cover those emissions under flag, taking into consideration the GHG protocol and sector and removals guidance on these issues. So we will make updates and modifications in future versions as needed.
Great, thank you. There's a couple of questions looking for clarification between or how flag defines supply side versus demand side, and what some of the additional expectations for companies on the demand side who choose to use the commodity pathways would be. Krista or Martha, would either of you like to take that?
Sure, I'm happy to. So as reflected in the questions, it is really difficult to clearly delineate between demand and supply side companies, particularly when you get into vertical integration or food companies that have a relatively short supply chain. And so for this version of the guidance, what we did was say, we encourage those companies who are on the demand side or self-identify themselves as more on the demand side, retailers, consumer product good companies, so they're further away from the production process. We're recommending those companies to use the sector pathway because that includes the whole sector. So it includes the forestry, it includes agriculture, it also includes those critical demand side actions. And so those are the types of companies that we would encourage to focus on the sector, the whole sector pathway. Whereas those companies who are closer to the land or kind of further upstream in the producers category, the commodity pathways are, assuming that there's coverage, right? We know that we only have 11 commodities and there's other commodities out there, that those are appropriate for the commodity pathways, again, assuming that they would surpass that 10% of emissions threshold from that specific commodity, with the exception being timber and wood fiber, which if they surpass that 10%, then of course they have to use it because of the role that the critical role that removals play within that sector. So that's the current guidance. And then if we can make headway on defining further demand and supply side companies within SBTi as a whole, then this is an area that I would flag for future updates as you're participating within the overall SBTi system.
Great, thanks, Martha. Krista, there's a question about the regionalization of the model. Could you give a little bit of background detail about how those regions were selected or defined?
Yeah, for the commodity pathways, as I mentioned, there are 26 world regions, and for companies who use the commodity pathways, they're required to provide that regional level of data. So you need to be able to provide sourcing information down to the level of 26 world regions. This is based on the underlying Image 3.0 integrated assessment model. That's the level of data resolution that we have based on that model. And so that's what we put into flag. It's still relatively coarse in terms of the variety of land emissions, but much more specific than we've been able to do in the past, and provides for much more robust targets as we've seen so far in our testing of these models.
Thanks. And Teresa, there was another element of that question, which was around the commodities that were selected. Again, can you give any background on why the 11 pathways that we have were chosen, what may come in the future, or what to do if a company if one of those 11 pathways does not apply to a company's inventory? Thanks.
Thanks, Tim. So first, companies should use the flag sector pathway if that is not a specific commodity pathway for the specific commodities. And the commodities that we have in the commodity pathway were chosen firstly based on the impact. They all have high carbon footprints, but also the inclusion of those commodities depends a lot on data availability. So because of data limitations, FLAG does not include commodity pathways for every single commodity. But we have received a lot of comments, especially during the public consultation, to add new commodities, which are some of them high impact as well, like cocoa, cotton, coffee, sugarcane, sunflower, aquaculture, and so on. So these and other commodities may be considered in the future, depending on data availability as well.
I would just add one thing to that, which I hadn't mentioned, but I am seeing in the chat, so that everybody knows when the commodity pathways are used and companies need to enter specific commodity data for specific regions. What the FLAG tool does, and you can see this by downloading it on our website, is that it aggregates automatically. You can see all the targets, sub-targets by region, but it also aggregates to the commodity level and also to the overall FLAG target level. So if you are using multiple commodity pathways or a commodity pathway and a sector pathway, the tool has all the functionality to aggregate those targets for you.
Great, thank you both. Martha, maybe a high-level question back to you. Why is the flag sector allowed to reduce, combined with the removals, less than the average 42% over 10 years?
Yeah, it's a great question. So some of you may have noticed in October 2021, when SBTi published the net zero standard, we included a flag for agriculture. We didn't get forestry completed in time, but we had a long-term pathway for the agriculture sector included within the net zero standard. And where the average for the other sectors, energy and industry, need to get down to 90% before abatement before moving into neutralization, the flag sector gets down to about 72% by 2050. And that's because, net zero is a systems concept. When the IPCC first put that out, it was really a kind of the world together approach is net zero. And so within that approach, or I guess within the pursuit of net zero, each different sector has a different role to play. And so when we look at the AFOLU sector as a whole, agriculture actually retains about 5 gigatons of emissions of methane and N2O emissions at the point of net zero. It looks like on a lot of the graphs that it nets out, because actually forestry needs to get to net negative. And so this again is why, we've treated the timber pathway slightly differently here, because this is much more a story of convergence than it is about each individual company getting to net zero. So that's a lot of the specificity we focused on in this modeling for the near-term pathways, for the long-term pathway, that actually this sector has a slightly different story than the rest, because of the types of products that it provides and where the ability to abate some of these emissions lies. So that's why it is a slightly different line.
Thanks, Martha. Looking at the clock, I think we have about 5 or 6 more minutes for question and answer. I know we won't get to all of them. I'll keep trying to prioritize the most frequently asked, but to any of the panelists, if you've seen questions that you want to answer, please feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in here because I think this 20% threshold and whether companies are above or below it, and whether or not they trigger having to set a flag target. So I think I just want to be really clear. Yes, we've set this 20% to say if you're above it, then you have to set a flag target. If you're below the 20%, that doesn't mean you get to ignore those emissions. You still need to include those emissions as part of your complete greenhouse gas inventory, but you could include that in your overall target that you set, kind of your traditional SBTi with your energy and industry emissions. But the caveat being that you would not be able to include removals within that target. So the only way you can include removals, again, is if you have this separate flag target. But I want to make sure, we need to, pursue inventory completeness to make sure we are managing everything in there. That is, again, the headline of what's happening is we've been not including these emissions in corporate inventories for decades. And that's what's being enabled right now by these two projects moving forward, is making sure we bring these emissions into inventories for the first time.
Thanks, Martha. Krista, maybe a question for you. From a food processing company already committed to SBTi, haven't submitted targets yet. They say a lot of our small family-owned suppliers don't know their carbon removals. Can we use averages from scientific research?
You know, the best thing to do here is, well, two things to say. First of all, in the flag target setting models, we've included removals, and that's to say that we've included what the science says about what removals are needed and expected to meet a 1.5 degree future. The other thing to say is that on the accounting side, when companies are doing their accounting for both their emissions and also their removals, where they should go for the latest guidance is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol land sector and removals guidance. So while we've accommodated removals fully in the flag tool, we need to look to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol to ensure that they're appropriately accounted for. And that means thinking about things like permanence and reversals and all the kinds of issues that we know are really important for removals.
Great, thank you. And maybe Martha, just a quick question around financial institutions and how they can apply the flag guidance for their purposes. Martha or Krista?
I'm going to actually kick that one to Krista.
Thanks for that question. As many of you would know, Science-Based Targets Initiative does have specific guidance for finance institutions. So for FIs, we do recommend looking there first. There are multiple approaches under the FI guidance that finance institutions can take. We also do anticipate in our initial review that there are cases where for finance institutions, especially where they're taking approaches looking at certain companies in their investment portfolio or for certain asset classes, flag targets may be relevant. We will work in the future on more guidance, doing a crosswalk between where the finance institutions guidance is and where the flag guidance is to see where there are the most relevant overlaps. But again, I recommend starting with that FI guidance and then reaching out as there are questions and you see relevant places for flag.
Great, thank you. And this is a question that may fall back more on the accounting side, but if there are carbon removals within a supply chain, but these are sold as offsets to another actor, should this be excluded from a flag target for the company? Not sure who might want to take that one.
I can take that one. And yeah, the answer is yes. So we can't have double counting of any removals or emissions reductions that would be credited. And that's on both sides, right? Like you wouldn't comply with any credible crediting agency if you were to qualify for the aspects of uniqueness and additionality. So if you're already selling this to someone else, then you wouldn't be able to report it within supply chain. So yeah, you can only do it in one of the two places.
Great, thanks. Krista, can you talk about the ability to combine flag emissions and flag removals? Is a net target acceptable or separate targets required? Can you just review that one more time?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when you go to the flag tool to set your targets, you will see that you're going to see separate data for the emission reductions and for the removals. We show very clearly where in the modeling we expect emission reduction and removals to come from, and companies will need to clearly and separately report on their emission reduction and the removals. When it comes to the top line target, companies can net, so combine those emission reduction and removals. There's one overarching flag target, but the specifics are very important. You need to report separately on the emission reductions and the removals, and you'll be able to see very clearly in the tool what's expected from each of those two buckets.
Thanks. Maybe a follow-up question there. A number of folks asking how, if at all, will removals be validated?
Again, here, the first point that I would turn to is looking to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol land sector and removals guidance. We've been working very closely with them, of course, to make sure that the target setting is really aligned with where the accounting is. And they've been really working hard on that removals piece, on how to make sure you're doing your accounting for removals, how to make sure that you're adequately considering permanence and thinking about reversals and all the kinds of things that are important when you're thinking about removals. As that guidance is finalized, we, of course, will review, and this covers removals, but every other topic to make sure that flag is well aligned and make updates where necessary in a future version.
Great, thank you. And I think we've got one last minute here, maybe one or two more questions for the panelists. Any questions that we haven't touched on that you've seen in the chat that you really want to make sure are answered?
So I was going to jump in. So first of all, I just pasted in the chat for everyone the link to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Land Sector Removals Guidance Draft, so you can go to that webpage and find out more information there. But one of the questions I really like here is about the sensitivity of the models and how are they going to react to climate change over time. And I think, again, just highlighting, you know, this is an area that is relatively underserved within the scientific literature. We would love to have models that are updated on a regular basis. We don't have an IEA for the land sector. And so I just want to kind of put the plug out there that maybe that's something we need to pursue as a broader community to make sure that we can really understand and update these various models to make sure that we're tracking to what's needed to pursue our collective goals. So thanks for those questions. We all know that that is a difficult space, but I think we could get there. The brains are available if we could further this approach.
Thank you so much, Martha. And maybe we'll leave our question and answer session there and move on to the next slide. So we knew we would have more questions than we'd have the time to answer today. I want to assure you that there is a lot of great information answering some of the questions we couldn't get to today on the Science Based Targets Initiative website, sciencebasedtargets.org. Find the sector guidance tab, and underneath that you'll see forest, land, and agriculture. And the FLAG website has a number of resources for your use. These recorded webinars will be posted there, as well as the FLAG guidance and FLAG tool that was reviewed today. These slides will be available on the website. There's a great frequently asked questions document that's going to get a lot of the general questions that we may not have had a chance to answer today, as well as a litany of resources that explain how we got to today and our process in developing the FLAG guidance. Martha just linked to the GHG Protocol Land Sector and Removals Guidance. Certainly encourage attendees today to go forward and review that draft. And if you have any questions that aren't covered or you can't find answers in the resources listed there, please do reach out to us. You can use flag@sciencebasedtargets.org to reach out directly to the FLAG team with questions. We certainly expect a lot following today, but we are here to help. We know this is new for many of you. And we look forward to seeing a number of companies that are on the call today submitting targets in the near future. So with that, I want to thank everyone involved from the FLAG project team, the Science Based Targets Initiative, everyone who provided feedback along the way, and thanks to all of you again for attending today. Team, again, thank you so much. Take care, everyone.